War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Aylmer and Louise Maude. Book 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Book 9, Chapter 1. Book 9, 1812. Chapter 1. From the close of the year 1811, intensified arming and concentrating of the forces of Western Europe began, and in 1812 these forces, millions of men, reckoning those transporting and feeding the army, moved from the west eastwards to the Russian frontier, toward which since 1811 Russian forces had been similarly drawn. On the 12th of June 1812 the forces of Western Europe crossed the Russian frontier, and war began. That is, an event took place opposed to human reason and to human nature. Millions of men perpetrated against one another such innumerable crimes, frauds, treacheries, thefts, forgeries, issues of false money, burglaries, incendiarisms, and murders as in whole centuries are not recorded in the annals of all the law courts of the world, but which those who committed them did not at the time regard as being crimes. What produced this extraordinary occurrence? What were its causes? The historians tell us with naive assurance that its causes were the wrongs inflicted on the Duke of Oldenburg, the non-observance of the continental system, the ambition of Napoleon, the firmness of Alexander, the mistakes of the diplomatists, and so on. Consequently, it would only have been necessary for Metternich, Rumyantsev, or Talleyrand, between a levee and an evening party, to have taken proper pains and written a more adroit note, or for Napoleon to have written to Alexander, "My respected brother, I consent to restore the duchy to the Duke of Oldenburg," and there would have been no war. We can understand that the matter seemed like that to contemporaries. It naturally seemed to Napoleon that the war was caused by England's intrigues, as in fact he said on the island of St. Helena. It naturally seemed to members of the English Parliament that the cause of the war was Napoleon's ambition. To the Duke of Oldenburg, that the cause of the war was the violence done to him. To businessmen, that the cause of the war was the continental system which was ruining Europe. To the generals and old soldiers, that the chief reason for the war was the necessity of giving them employment. To the legitimists of that day, that it was in need of re-establishing les bons principes, and to the diplomatists of the time, that it all resulted from the fact that the alliance between Russia and Austria in 1809 had not been sufficiently well concealed from Napoleon, and from the awkward wording of Memorandum number 178. It is natural that these and a countless and infinite quantity of other reasons, the number depending on the endless diversity of points of view, presented themselves to the men of that day. But to us, to posterity, who view the thing that happened in all its magnitude and perceive its plain and terrible meaning, these causes seem insufficient. To us it is incomprehensible that millions of Christian men killed and tortured each other either because Napoleon was ambitious or Alexander was firm, or because England's policy was astute or the Duke of Oldenburg wronged. We cannot grasp what connection such circumstances have with the actual fact of slaughter and violence. Why, because a duke was wronged, thousands of men from the other side of Europe killed and ruined the people of Smolensk and Moscow, and were killed by them. To us, their descendants, who are not historians and are not carried away by the process of research, and can therefore regard the event with unclouded common sense, an incalculable number of causes present themselves. The deeper we delve in search of these causes, the more of them we find, and each separate cause, or whole series of causes, appears to us equally valid in itself and equally false by its insignificance compared to the magnitude of the events, and by its impotence, apart from the cooperation of all the other coincident causes, to occasion the event. To us, the wish or objection of this or that French corporal to serve a second term appears as much a cause as Napoleon's refusal to withdraw his troops beyond the Vistula and to restore the Duchy of Oldenburg, for had he not wished to serve, and had a second, a third, and 1,000th corporal and private also refused, there would have been so many less men in Napoleon's army, and the war could not have occurred. Had Napoleon not taken offense at the demand that he should withdraw beyond the Vistula, and not ordered his troops to advance, there would have been no war. But had all his sergeants objected to serving a second term, then also there could have been no war. Nor could there have been a war had there been no English intrigues and no Duke of Oldenburg, and had Alexander not felt insulted, and had there not been an autocratic government in Russia, or a revolution in France, and a subsequent dictatorship and empire, or all the things that produced the French Revolution, and so on. Without each of these causes nothing could have happened. So all these causes, myriads of causes, coincided to bring it about. And so there was no one cause for that occurrence, but it had to occur because it had to. Millions of men, renouncing their human feelings and reason, had to go from west to east to slay their fellows, just as some centuries previously hordes of men had come from the east to the west, slaying their fellows. The actions of Napoleon and Alexander, on whose words the event seemed to hang, were as little voluntary as the actions of any soldier who was drawn into the campaign by lot or by conscription. This could not be otherwise, for in order that the will of Napoleon and Alexander, on whom the event seemed to depend, should be carried out, the concurrence of innumerable circumstances was needed without any one of which the event could not have taken place. It was necessary that millions of men in whose hands lay the real power, the soldiers who fired or transported provisions and guns, should consent to carry out the will of these weak individuals, and should have been induced to do so by an infinite number of diverse and complex causes. We are forced to fall back on fatalism as an explanation of irrational events, that is to say, events the reasonableness of which we do not understand. The more we try to explain such events in history reasonably, the more unreasonable and incomprehensible do they become to us. Each man lives for himself, using his freedom to attain his personal aims, and feels with his whole being that he can now do or abstain from doing this or that action, but as soon as he has done it, that action performed at a certain moment in time becomes irrevocable and belongs to history, in which it has not a free but a predestined significance. There are two sides to the life of every man: his individual life, which is the more free the more abstract its interests, and his elemental hive life, in which he inevitably obeys laws laid down for him. Man lives consciously for himself, but is an unconscious instrument in the attainment of the historic, universal aims of humanity. A deed done is irrevocable, and its result, coinciding in time with the actions of millions of other men, assumes an historic significance. The higher a man stands on the social ladder, the more people he is connected with, and the more power he has over others, the more evident is the predestination and inevitability of his every action. The king's heart is in the hands of the Lord. A king is history's slave. History, that is, the unconscious, general, hive life of mankind, uses every moment of the life of kings as a tool for its own purposes. Though Napoleon at the time, in 1812, was more convinced than ever that it depended on him, verser ou ne pas verser le sang de ses peuples, that is, to shed or not to shed the blood of his peoples, as Alexander expressed it in the last letter he wrote him, he had never been so much in the grip of inevitable laws, which compelled him, while thinking that he was acting on his own volition, to perform for the hive life, that is to say for history, whatever had to be performed. The people of the West moved eastwards to slay their fellow men, and by the law of coincidence thousands of minute causes fitted in and coordinated to produce that movement and war. Reproaches for the non-observance of the continental system, the Duke of Oldenburg's wrongs, the movement of troops into Prussia, undertaken, as it seemed to Napoleon, only for the purpose of securing an armed peace, the French Emperor's love and habit of war, coinciding with his people's inclinations, allurement by the grandeur of the preparations and the expenditure on those preparations, and the need of obtaining advantages to compensate for that expenditure, the intoxicating honors he received in Dresden, the diplomatic negotiations which, in the opinion of contemporaries, were carried on with a sincere desire to obtain peace, but which only wounded the self-love of both sides, and millions of other causes that adapted themselves to the event that was happening or coincided with it. When an apple has ripened and falls, why does it fall? Because of its attraction to the earth? Because its stalk withers? Because it is dried by the sun? Because it grows heavier? Because the wind shakes it? Or because the boy standing below wants to eat it? Nothing is the cause. All this is only the coincidence of conditions in which all vital, organic and elemental events occur. And the botanist who finds that the apple falls because the cellular tissue decays and so forth is equally right with the child who stands under the tree and says the apple fell because he wanted to eat it and prayed for it. Equally right or wrong is he who says that Napoleon went to Moscow because he wanted to, and perished because Alexander desired his destruction, and he who says that an undermined hill weighing 1,000,000 tons fell because the last navvy struck it for the last time with his mattock. In historic events, the so-called great men are labels, giving names to events, and like labels, they have but the smallest connection with the event itself. Every act of theirs, which appears to them an act of their own will, is in an historical sense involuntary, and is related to the whole course of history and predestined from eternity. End of chapter 1. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
War and Peace, Book 9, Chapter 2, read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Patinama. Chapter 2.
On the 29th of May, Napoleon left Dresden, where he had spent 3 weeks surrounded by a court that included princes, dukes, kings, and even an emperor. Before leaving, Napoleon showed favor to the emperor, kings, and princes who had deserved it, reprimanded the kings and princes with whom he was dissatisfied, presented pearls and diamonds of his own, that is, which he had taken from other kings, to the Empress of Austria, and having, as his historian tells us, tenderly embraced the Empress Marie Louise, who regarded him as her husband, though he had left another wife in Paris, left her grieved by the parting which she seemed hardly able to bear. Though the diplomatists still firmly believed in the possibility of peace and worked zealously to that end, and though the Emperor Napoleon himself wrote a letter to Alexander, calling him Monsieur mon frère, and sincerely assured him that he did not want war and would always love and honor him, yet he set off to join his army, and at every station gave fresh orders to accelerate the movement of his troops from west to east. He went in a traveling coach with 6 horses, surrounded by pages, aides de camp, and an escort, along the road to Posen, Thorn, Danzig, and Königsberg. At each of these towns thousands of people met him with excitement and enthusiasm. The army was moving from west to east, and relays of 6 horses carried him in the same direction. On the 10th of June, old style, coming up with the army, he spent the night in apartments prepared for him on the estate of a Polish count in the Wilkowiski forest. Next day, overtaking the army, he went in a carriage to the Neman, and, changing into a Polish uniform, he drove to the river bank in order to select a place for the crossing. Seeing on the other side some Cossacks, les Cosaques, and the wide spreading steppes in the midst of which lay the holy city of Moscow, Moscou, la ville sainte, the capital of a realm such as the Scythia into which Alexander the Great had marched, Napoleon, unexpectedly, and contrary alike to strategic and diplomatic considerations, ordered an advance, and the next day his army began to cross the Neman. Early in the morning of the 12th of June he came out of his tent, which was pitched that day on the steep left bank of the Neman, and looked through a spyglass at the streams of his troops pouring out of the Wilkowiski forest and flowing over the 3 bridges thrown across the river. The troops, knowing of the Emperor's presence, were on the lookout for him, and when they caught sight of a figure in an overcoat and a cocked hat standing apart from his suite in front of his tent on the hill, they threw up their caps and shouted "Vive l'Empereur!" and one after another poured in a ceaseless stream out of the vast forest that had concealed them, and, separating, flowed on and on by the 3 bridges to the other side.
Now we'll go into action. Oh, when he takes it in hand himself, things get hot. By heaven, there he is! Vive l'Empereur! So these are the steppes of Asia. It's a nasty country all the same. Au revoir, Boche. I'll keep the best palace in Moscow for you. Au revoir. Good luck. Did you see the Emperor? Vive l'Empereur! Preur. If they make me governor of India, Gérard, I'll make you minister of Kashmir. That's settled. Vive l'Empereur! Hurrah! 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 The Cossacks, those rascals, see how they run. Vive l'Empereur! There he is. Do you see him? I've seen him twice, as I see you now. The little corporal. I saw him give the cross to one of the veterans. Vive l'Empereur!
Came the voices of men, old and young, of most diverse characters and social positions. On the faces of all was one common expression of joy at the commencement of the long-expected campaign, and of rapture and devotion to the man in the grey coat who was standing on the hill. On the 13th of June, a rather small, thoroughbred Arab horse was brought to Napoleon. He mounted it and rode at a gallop to one of the bridges over the Neman, deafened continually by incessant and rapturous acclamations, which he evidently endured only because it was impossible to forbid the soldiers to express their love of him by such shouting, but the shouting which accompanied him everywhere disturbed him and distracted him from the military cares that had occupied him from the time he joined the army. He rode across one of the swaying pontoon bridges to the farther side, turned sharply to the left, and galloped in the direction of Kovno, preceded by enraptured mounted chasseurs of the guard, who, breathless with delight, galloped ahead to clear a path for him through the troops. On reaching the broad river Vilna, he stopped near a regiment of Polish Uhlans stationed by the river. "Vivat!" shouted the Poles ecstatically, breaking their ranks and pressing against one another to see him. Napoleon looked up and down the river, dismounted, and sat down on a log that lay on the bank. At a mute sign from him, a telescope was handed him, which he rested on the back of a happy page who had run up to him, and he gazed at the opposite bank. Then he became absorbed in a map laid out on the logs. Without lifting his head he said something, and two of his aides-de-camp galloped off to the Polish Uhlans. "What? What did he say?" was heard in the ranks of the Polish Uhlans, when one of the aides-de-camp rode up to them. The order was to find a fort and to cross the river. The colonel of the Polish Uhlans, a handsome old man, flushed and, fumbling in his speech from excitement, asked the aide-de-camp whether he would be permitted to swim the river with his Uhlans, instead of seeking a fort. In evident fear of refusal, like a boy asking for permission to get on a horse, he begged to be allowed to swim across the river before the Emperor's eyes. The aide-de-camp replied that probably the Emperor would not be displeased at this excess of zeal. As soon as the aide-de-camp had said this, the old moustached officer, with happy face and sparkling eyes, raised his saber, shouted "Vivat!" and, commanding the Uhlans to follow him, spurred his horse and galloped into the river. He gave an angry thrust to his horse, which had grown restive under him, and plunged into the water, heading for the deepest part where the current was swift. Hundreds of Uhlans galloped in after him. It was cold and uncanny in the rapid current in the middle of the stream, and the Uhlans caught hold of one another as they fell off their horses. Some of the horses were drowned, and some of the men. The others tried to swim on, some in the saddle and some clinging to the horses' manes. They tried to make their way forward to the opposite bank, and, though there was a ford 1/3 of a mile away, were proud that they were swimming and drowning in this river under the eyes of the man who sat on the log and was not even looking at what they were doing. When the aide-de-camp, having returned and choosing an opportune moment, ventured to draw the Emperor's attention to the devotion of the Poles to his person, the little man in the grey overcoat got up and, having summoned Berthier, began pacing up and down the bank with him, giving him instructions and occasionally glancing disapprovingly at the drowning Uhlans who distracted his attention. For him it was no new conviction that his presence in any part of the world, from Africa to the steppes of Muscovy alike, was enough to dumbfound people and impel them to insane self-oblivion. He called for his horse and rode to his quarters. Some 40 Uhlans were drowned in the river, though boats were sent to their assistance. The majority struggled back to the bank from which they had started. The colonel and some of his men got across and with difficulty clambered out on the further bank. And as soon as they had got out, in their soaked and streaming clothes, they shouted "Vivat!" and looked ecstatically at the spot where Napoleon had been but where he no longer was, and at that moment considered themselves happy. That evening, between issuing one order that the forged Russian paper money prepared for use in Russia should be delivered as quickly as possible, and another that the Saxon should be shot, on whom a letter containing information about the orders to the French army had been found, Napoleon also gave instructions that the Polish colonel who had needlessly plunged into the river should be enrolled in the Légion d'honneur, of which Napoleon was himself the head. Quos vult perdere dementat, Those whom God wishes to destroy, he drives mad. End of chapter 2. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands. War and Peace, Book 9, Chapter 3. Read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Patinama. Chapter 3. The Emperor of Russia had, meanwhile, been in Vilna for more than a month, reviewing troops and holding maneuvers. Nothing was ready for the war that everyone expected, and to prepare for which the Emperor had come from Petersburg. There was no general plan of action. The vacillation between the various plans that were proposed had even increased after the Emperor had been at headquarters for a month. Each of the three armies had its own commander-in-chief, but there was no supreme commander of all the forces, and the Emperor did not assume that responsibility himself. The longer the Emperor remained in Vilna, the less did everybody, tired of waiting, prepare for the war. All the efforts of those who surrounded the sovereign seemed directed merely to making him spend his time pleasantly and forget that war was impending. In June, after many balls and fêtes given by the Polish magnates, by the courtiers, and by the Emperor himself, it occurred to one of the Polish aides de camp in attendance that a dinner and ball should be given for the Emperor by his aide de camp. This idea was eagerly received. The Emperor gave his consent. The aide de camp collected money by a subscription. The lady who was thought to be most pleasing to the Emperor was invited to act as hostess. Count Bennigsen, being a landowner in the Vilna province, offered his country house for the fete, and the 13th of June was fixed for a ball, dinner, regatta, and fireworks at Zakret, Count Bennigsen's country seat. The very day that Napoleon issued the order to cross the Neman, and his vanguard, driving off the Cossacks, crossed the Russian frontier, Alexander spent the evening at the entertainment given by his aide de camp at Bennigsen's country house. It was a gay and brilliant fete. Connoisseurs of such matters declared that rarely had so many beautiful women been assembled in one place. Countess Besuchowa was present among other Russian ladies, who had followed the sovereign from Petersburg to Vilna, and eclipsed the refined Polish ladies by her massive so-called Russian type of beauty. The Emperor noticed her and honored her with a dance. Boris Trubetskoy, having left his wife in Moscow and being for the present en garçon, as he phrased it, was also there, and, though not an aide de camp, had subscribed a large sum toward the expenses. Boris was now a rich man, who had risen to high honors and no longer sought patronage, but stood on an equal footing with the highest of those of his own age. He was meeting Hélène in Vilna after not having seen her for a long time, and did not recall the past. But as Hélène was enjoying the favors of a very important personage, and Boris had only recently married, they met as good friends of long standing. At midnight, dancing was still going on. Hélène, not having a suitable partner, herself offered to dance the mazurka with Boris. They were the third couple. Boris, coolly looking at Hélène's dazzling bare shoulders which emerged from a dark, gold-embroidered gauze gown, talked to her of old acquaintances, and at the same time, unaware of it himself and unnoticed by others, never for an instant ceased to observe the Emperor, who was in the same room. The Emperor was not dancing, he stood in the doorway, stopping now one pair and now another with gracious words which she alone knew how to utter. As the mazurka began, Boris saw that Adjutant General Balashev, one of those in closest attendance on the Emperor, went up to him and, contrary to court etiquette, stood near him while he was talking to a Polish lady. Having finished speaking to her, the Emperor looked inquiringly at Balashev, and, evidently understanding that he only acted thus because there were important reasons for so doing, nodded slightly to the lady and turned to him. Hardly had Balashov begun to speak before a look of amazement appeared on the Emperor's face. He took Balashov by the arm and crossed the room with him, unconsciously clearing a path 7 yards wide as the people on both sides made way for him. Borís noticed Arakcheyev's excited face when the sovereign went out with Balashov. Arakcheyev looked at the Emperor from under his brow and, sniffing with his red nose, stepped forward from the crowd as if expecting the Emperor to address him. Borís understood that Arakcheyev envied Balashov and was displeased that evidently important news had reached the Emperor otherwise than through himself. But the Emperor and Balashov passed out into the illuminated garden without noticing Arakcheyev, who, holding his sword and glancing wrathfully around, followed some 20 paces behind them. All the time Borís was going through the figures of the mazurka, he was worried by the question of what news Balashov had brought and how he could find it out before others. In the figure in which he had to choose 2 ladies, he whispered to Hélène that he meant to choose Countess Potocka, who, he thought, had gone out onto the veranda, and glided over the parquet to the door opening into the garden, where, seeing Balashov and the Emperor returning to the veranda, he stood still. They were moving toward the door. Borís, fluttering as if he had not had time to withdraw, respectfully pressed close to the doorpost with bowed head. The Emperor, with the agitation of one who has been personally affronted, was finishing with these words: "To enter Russia without declaring war. I will not make peace as long as a single armed enemy remains in my country." It seemed to Borís that it gave the Emperor pleasure to utter these words. He was satisfied with the form in which he had expressed his thoughts, but displeased that Borís had overheard it. "Let no one know of it," the Emperor added with a frown. Borís understood that this was meant for him, and, closing his eyes, slightly bowed his head. The Emperor re-entered the ballroom and remained there about another half-hour. Borís was thus the first to learn the news that the French army had crossed the Neman, and, thanks to this, was able to show certain important personages that much that was concealed from others was usually known to him, and by this means he rose higher in their estimation. The unexpected news of the French having crossed the Neman was particularly startling after a month of unfulfilled expectations, and at a ball. On first receiving the news, under the influence of indignation and resentment, the Emperor had found a phrase that pleased him, fully expressed his feelings, and has since become famous. On returning home at 2 o'clock that night, he sent for his secretary, Shishkov, and told him to write an order to the troops and a rescript to Field Marshal Prince Saltykov, in which he insisted on the words being inserted that he would not make peace so long as a single armed Frenchman remained on Russian soil. Next day the following letter was sent to Napoleon. Monsieur mon frère, yesterday I learned that, despite the loyalty which I have kept my engagements with your Majesty, your troops have crossed the Russian frontier, and I have this moment received from Petersburg a note in which Count Lauriston informs me, as a reason for this aggression, that your Majesty has considered yourself to be in a state of war with me from the time Prince Kuragin asked for his passports. The reasons on which the Duc de Bassano based his refusal to deliver them to him would never have led me to suppose that that could serve as a pretext for aggression. In fact, the ambassador, as he himself has declared, was never authorized to make that demand, and as soon as I was informed of it, I let him know how much I disapproved of it and ordered him to remain at his post. If your Majesty does not intend to shed the blood of our peoples for such a misunderstanding, and consents to withdraw your troops from Russian territory, I will regard what has passed as not having occurred, and an understanding between us will be possible. In the contrary case, your Majesty, I shall see myself forced to repel an attack that nothing on my part has provoked. It still depends on your Majesty to preserve humanity from the calamity of another war. I am, etc. Signed, Alexander. End of chapter 3. Recording by Ernst Patinama, Amsterdam, the Netherlands.
Peace, Book 9, Chapter 4. Read for LibriVox.org by Julie van Wallichem. At 2 in the morning of the 14th of June, the Emperor, having sent for Balashev and read him his letter to Napoleon, ordered him to take it and hand it personally to the French Emperor. When dispatching Balashev, the Emperor repeated to him the words that he would not make peace so long as a single armed enemy remained on Russian soil, and told him to transmit those words to Napoleon. Alexander did not insert them in his letter to Napoleon, because with his characteristic tact he felt it would be injudicious to use them at a moment when a last attempt at reconciliation was being made, but he definitely instructed Balashev to repeat them personally to Napoleon. Having set off in the small hours of the 14th, accompanied by a bugler and 2 Cossacks, Balashev reached the French outposts at the village of Riconti on the Russian side of the Neman by dawn. There he was stopped by French cavalry sentinels. A French non-commissioned officer of hussars in crimson uniform and a shaggy cap shouted to the approaching Balashev to halt. Balashev did not do so at once, but continued to advance along the road at a walking pace. The non-commissioned officer frowned, and, muttering words of abuse, advanced his horse's chest against Balashev, put his hand to his sabre, and shouted rudely at the Russian general, asking, was he deaf, that he did not do as he was told? Balashev mentioned who he was. The non-commissioned officer began talking with his comrades about regimental matters, without looking at the Russian general. After living at the seat of the highest authority and power, after conversing with the Emperor less than 3 hours before, and in general being accustomed to the respect due to his rank in the service, Balashev found it very strange here on Russian soil to encounter this hostile and still more this disrespectful application of brute force to himself. The sun was only just appearing from behind the clouds. The air was fresh and dewy. A herd of cattle was being driven along the road from the village, and over the fields the larks rose trilling one after another, like bubbles rising in water. Balashev looked around him, awaiting the arrival of an officer from the village. The Russian Cossacks and bugler and the French hussars looked silently at one another from time to time. A French colonel of hussars, who had evidently just left his bed, came riding from the village on a handsome sleek grey horse, accompanied by 2 hussars. The officer, the soldiers, and their horses all looked smart and well kept. It was at that first period of a campaign, when troops are still in full trim, almost like that of peace-time manoeuvres, but with a shade of martial swagger in their clothes, and a touch of the gaiety and spirit of enterprise, which always accompany the opening of a campaign. The French colonel with difficulty repressed a yawn, but was polite, and evidently understood Balashev's importance. He let him pass the soldiers, and behind the outposts, that his wish to be presented to the Emperor would most likely be satisfied immediately, as the Emperor's quarters were, he believed, not far off. They rode through the village of Riconti, past tethered French hussar horses, past sentinels and men who saluted their colonel and stared with curiosity at a Russian uniform, and came out at the other end of the village. The colonel said that the commander of the division was 1.25 miles away, and would receive Balashev and conduct him to his destination. The sun had by now risen and shone gaily on the bright verdure. They had hardly ridden up a hill past a tavern before they saw a group of horsemen coming toward them. In front of the group, On a black horse with trappings that glittered in the sun rode a tall man with plumes in his hat and black hair curling down to his shoulders. He wore a red mantle and stretched his long legs forward in French fashion. This man rode toward Balashev at a gallop, his plumes flowing and his gems and gold lace glittering in the bright June sunshine. Balashev was only 2 horses' lengths from the equestrian with the bracelets, plumies, necklaces, and gold embroidery, who was galloping toward him with a theatrically solemn countenance, when Gilner, the French colonel, whispered respectfully, "The King of Naples." It was in fact Murat, now called King of Naples. Though it was quite incomprehensible why he should be King of Naples, he was called so, and was himself convinced that he was so, and therefore assumed a more solemn and important air than formerly. He was so sure that he really was the King of Naples, that when, on the eve of his departure from that city, while walking through the streets with his wife, some Italians called out to him, "Viva il re!" Translator's note: Long live the king. End of note. He turned to his wife with a pensive smile and said, "Poor fellows, they don't know that I am leaving them tomorrow." But though he firmly believed himself to be King of Naples, and pitied the grief felt by the subjects he was abandoning, latterly, after he had been ordered to return to military service, and especially since his last interview with Napoleon in Danzig, when his august brother-in-law had told him, "I made you king that you should reign in my way, but not in yours," he had cheerfully taken up his familiar business, and, like a well-fed but not over-fed horse that feels himself in harness and grows skittish between the shafts, he dressed up in clothes as variegated and expensive as possible, and gaily and contentedly galloped along the roads of Poland, without himself knowing why or whither. On seeing the Russian general, he threw back his head, with its long hair curling to his shoulders, in a majestically royal manner, and looked inquiringly at the French colonel. The colonel respectfully informed his Majesty of Balashev's mission, whose name he could not pronounce. "De Balmachev," said the king, overcoming by his assurance the difficulty that had presented itself to the colonel. "Charmed to make your acquaintance, General," he added with a gesture of kingly condescension. As soon as the king began to speak loud and fast, his royal dignity instantly forsook him, and without noticing it, he passed into his natural tone of good-natured familiarity. He laid his hand on the withers of Balashev's horse and said, "Well, General, it all looks like war," as if regretting a circumstance of which he was unable to judge. "Your Majesty," replied Balashev, "my master, the Emperor, does not desire war, and as your Majesty sees," said Balashev, using the words "your Majesty" at every opportunity, with the affectation unavoidable in frequently addressing one to whom the title was still a novelty. Murat's face beamed with stupid satisfaction as he listened to "Monsieur de Balmachev." But royauté oblige. Translator's note: Royalty has its obligations. End of note. And he felt it incumbent on him, as a king and an ally, to confer on state affairs with Alexander's envoy. He dismounted, took Balashev's arm, and moving a few steps away from his suite, which waited respectfully, began to pace up and down with him, trying to speak significantly. He referred to the fact that the Emperor Napoleon had resented the demand that he should withdraw his troops from Prussia, especially when the demand became generally known and the dignity of France was thereby offended. Balashev replied that there was nothing offensive in the demand because— but Murat interrupted him. "Then you don't consider the Emperor Alexander the aggressor?" he asked unexpectedly, with a kindly and foolish smile. Balashev told him why he considered Napoleon to be the originator of the war. "Oh, my dear General," Murat again interrupted him, "with all my heart I wish the Emperors may arrange the affair between them, and that the war begun by no wish of mine may finish as quickly as possible," said he, in the tone of a servant who wants to remain good friends with another despite a quarrel between their masters. And he went on to inquire about the Grand Duke and the state of his health, and to reminiscence of the gay and amusing times he had spent with him in Naples. Then suddenly, as if remembering his royal dignity, Murat solemnly drew himself up, assumed the pose in which he had stood at his coronation, and waving his right hand, said, "I won't detain you longer, General. I wish success to your mission." And with his embroidered red mantle, his flowing feathers, and his glittering ornaments, he rejoined his suite, who were respectfully waiting him. Balashev rode on, supposing from Murat's words that he would very soon be brought before Napoleon himself. But instead of that, at the next village, the sentinels of Davout's infantry corps detained him as the piquets of the vanguard had done, and an adjutant of the corps commander, who was fetched, conducted him into the village to Marshal Davout. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Seeloff. Davout was to Napoleon what Arakcheyev was to Alexander. Though not a coward like Arakcheyev, he was as precise, as cruel, and as unable to express his devotion to his monarch except by cruelty. In the organization of states, such men are necessary, as wolves are necessary in the organism of nature, and they always exist, always appear, and hold their own, however incongruous their presence and their proximity to the head of the government may be. This inevitability alone can explain how the cruel Arakcheyev, who tore out a grenadier's mustache with his own hands, whose weak nerves rendered him unable to face danger, and who was neither an educated man nor a courtier, was able to maintain his powerful position with Alexander, whose own character was chivalrous, noble, and gentle. Balashev found Davout seated on a barrel in the shed of a peasant's hut, writing. He was auditing accounts. Better quarters could have been found him, but Marshal Davout was one of those men who purposely put themselves in most depressing conditions to have a justification for being gloomy. For the same reason they are always hard at work and in a hurry. How can I think of the bright side of life when, as you see, I am sitting on a barrel and working in a dirty shed? The expression of his face seemed to say. The chief pleasure and necessity of such men, when they encounter anyone who shows animation, is to flaunt their own dreary, persistent activity. Davout allowed himself that pleasure when Balashev was brought in. He became still more absorbed in his task when the Russian general entered, and after glancing over his spectacles at Balashev's face, which was animated by the beauty of the morning and by his talk with Murat, he did not rise or even stir, but scowled still more and sneered malevolently. When he noticed in Balashev's face the disagreeable impression this reception produced, Davout raised his head and coldly asked what he wanted. Thinking he could have been received in such a manner only because Davout did not know that he was the adjutant general to the Emperor Alexander, and even his envoy to Napoleon, Balashev hastened to inform him of his rank and mission. Contrary to his expectation, Davout, after hearing him, became still surlier and ruder. "Where's your dispatch?" he inquired. "Give it to me. I will send it to the Emperor." Balashev replied that he had been ordered to hand it personally to the Emperor. "Your Emperor's orders are obeyed in your army, but here," said Davout, "you must do as you're told." And as if to make the Russian general still more conscious of his dependence on brute force, Davout sent an adjutant to call the officer on duty. Balashev took out the packet containing the Emperor's letter and laid it on the table, made of a door with its hinges still hanging on it, laid across two barrels. Davout took the packet and read the inscription. "You're perfectly at liberty to treat me with respect or not," protested Balashev, "but permit me to observe that I have the honor to be the adjutant general to His Majesty, and—" Davout glanced at him silently and plainly derived pleasure from the signs of agitation and confusion which appeared on Balashev's face. "You will be treated as is fitting," said he, putting the packet in his pocket, left the shed. A minute later the marshal's adjutant de Castres came in and conducted Balashev to the quarters assigned him. That day he dined with the marshal, at the same board on the barrels. Next day Davout rode out early. After asking Balashev to come to him, peremptorily requested him to remain there, to move on with the baggage train should orders come for it to move, and to talk to no one except to Monsieur de Castres. After 4 days of solitude, ennui, and consciousness of his own impotence and insignificance, particularly acute by contrast with the sphere of power in which he had so lately moved, and after several marches with the marshal's baggage and the French army, which occupied the whole district, Balashev was brought to Vilna, now occupied by the French, through the very gate by which he had left it 4 days previously. Next day the imperial gentleman-in-waiting, the Comte de Turenne, came to Balashev and informed him of the Emperor Napoleon's wish to honor him with an audience. 4 days before, sentinels of the Preobrazhensk regiment had stood in front of the house to which Balashev was conducted, and now 2 French grenadiers stood there in blue uniforms, unfastened in front and with shaggy caps on their heads, and an escort of hussars and uhlans, and a brilliant suite of aides-de-camp, pages, and generals who were waiting for Napoleon to come out, were standing at the porch, round his saddle-horse and his Mameluke Rustan. Napoleon received Balashev in the very house in Vilna from which Alexander had dispatched him on his mission. End of Chapter 5. Book 9, Chapter 6, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Seeloff. Though Balashev was used to imperial pomp, he was amazed at the luxury and magnificence of Napoleon's court. The Comte de Turenne showed him into a big reception room where many generals, gentlemen-in-waiting, and Polish magnates, several of whom Balashev had seen at the court of the Emperor of Russia, were waiting. Duroc said that Napoleon would receive the Russian general before going for his ride. After some minutes, the gentleman-in-waiting who was on duty came into the great reception room and, bowing politely, asked Balashev to follow him. Balashev went into a small reception room, one door of which led into a study, the very one from which the Russian emperor had dispatched him on his mission. He stood a minute or two, waiting. He heard hurried footsteps beyond the door. Both halves of it were opened rapidly. All was silent, and then from the study the sound was heard of other steps, firm and resolute. They were those of Napoleon. He had just finished dressing for his ride, and wore a blue uniform, opening in front over a white waistcoat so long that it covered his rotund stomach, white leather breeches tightly fitting the fat thighs of his short legs, and Hessian boots. His short hair had evidently just been brushed, but one lock hung down the middle of his broad forehead. His plump white neck stood out sharply above the black collar of his uniform, and he smelled of eau de cologne. His full face, rather young-looking, with its prominent chin, wore a gracious and majestic expression of imperial welcome. He entered briskly, with a jerk at every step and his head slightly thrown back. His whole short, corpulent figure, with broad, thick shoulders, and chest and stomach involuntarily protruding, had that imposing and stately appearance one sees in men of 40 who live in comfort. It was evident, too, that he was in the best of spirits that day. He nodded in answer to Balashev's low and respectful bow, and coming up to him at once began speaking like a man who values every moment of his time and does not condescend to prepare what he has to say, but is sure he will always say the right thing and say it well. "Good day, General," said he. "I have received the letter you brought from the Emperor Alexander, and am very glad to see you." He glanced with his large eyes into Balashev's face, and immediately looked past him. It was plain that Balashev's personality did not interest him at all. Evidently, only what took place within his own mind interested him. Nothing outside himself had any significance for him, because everything in the world, it seemed to him, depended entirely on his will. "I do not, and did not, desire war," he continued, "but it has been forced on me, even now." He emphasized the word. "I am ready to receive any explanations you can give me." And he began clearly and concisely to explain his reasons for dissatisfaction with the Russian government. Judging by the calmly moderate and amicable tone in which the French Emperor spoke, Balashev was firmly persuaded that he wished for peace and intended to enter into negotiations. When Napoleon, having finished speaking, looked inquiringly at the Russian envoy, Balashev began a speech he had prepared long before. "Sire, the Emperor, my master—" But the sight of the Emperor's eyes bent on him confused him. "You are flurried. Compose yourself," Napoleon seemed to say. as with a scarcely perceptible smile he looked at Balashev's uniform and sword. Balashev recovered himself and began to speak. He said that the Emperor Alexander did not consider Kurakin's demand for his passports a sufficient cause for war, that Kurakin had acted on his own initiative and without his sovereign's assent, that the Emperor Alexander did not desire war and had no relations with England. "Not yet," interposed Napoleon, and as if fearing to give vent to his feelings, he frowned and nodded slightly, as a sign that Balashev might proceed. After saying all that he had been instructed to say, Balashev added that the Emperor Alexander wished for peace, but would not enter into negotiations except on condition that, here Balashev hesitated, he remembered the words the Emperor Alexander had not written in his letter, but had specially inserted in the rescript to Saltykov and had told Balashev to repeat to Napoleon. Balashev remembered these words: "So long as a single armed foe remains on Russian soil," but some complex feeling restrained him. He could not utter them, though he wished to do so. He grew confused and said, "On condition that the French army retires beyond the Neman." Napoleon noticed Balashev's embarrassment when uttering these last words. His face twitched and the calf of his left leg began to quiver rhythmically. Without moving from where he stood, he began speaking in a louder tone and more hurriedly than before. During the speech that followed, Balashev, who more than once lowered his eyes, involuntarily noticed the quivering of Napoleon's left leg, which increased the more Napoleon raised his voice. "I desire peace no less than the Emperor Alexander," he began. "Have I not for 18 months been doing everything to obtain it? I have waited for 18 months for explanations. But in order to begin negotiations, what is demanded of me?" he said, frowning and making an energetic gesture of inquiry with his small, white, plump hand. "The withdrawal of your army beyond the Neman, sire," replied Balashev. "The Neman," replied Napoleon. "So now you want me to retire beyond the Neman." "Only the Neman?" repeated Napoleon, looking straight at Balashev. The latter bowed his head respectfully. Instead of the demand of 4 months earlier to withdraw from Pomerania, only a withdrawal beyond the Neman was now demanded. Napoleon turned quickly and began to pace the room. "You say the demand now is that I am to withdraw beyond the Neman before commencing negotiations. But in just the same way 2 months ago the demand was that I should withdraw beyond the Vistula and Oder, and yet you are willing to negotiate." He went in silence from one corner of the room to the other, and again stopped in front of Balashev. Balashev noticed that his left leg was quivering faster than before, and his face seemed petrified in its stern expression. This quivering of his left leg was a thing Napoleon was conscious of. "The vibration of my left calf is a great sign with me," he remarked at a later date. "Such demands as to retreat beyond the Vistula and Oder may be made to the Prince of Baden, but not to me," Napoleon almost screamed, quite to his own surprise. "If you gave me Petersburg and Moscow, I could not accept such conditions. You say I have begun this war, but who first joined his army? The Emperor Alexander, not I, and you offer me negotiations when I have expended millions, when you are in alliance with England, and when your position is a bad one. You offer me negotiations. But what is the aim of your alliances with England? What has she given you?" he continued hurriedly, evidently no longer trying to show the advantages of peace and discuss its possibility, but only to prove his own rectitude and power and Alexander's errors and duplicity. The commencement of his speech had obviously been made with the intention of demonstrating the advantages of his position and showing that he was nevertheless willing to negotiate. But he had begun talking, and the more he talked, the less he could control his words. The whole purport of his remarks now was evidently to exalt himself and insult Alexander, just what he had least desired at the commencement of the interview. "I hear you have made peace with Turkey." Balashev bowed his head affirmatively. "Peace has been concluded," he began, but Napoleon did not let him speak. He evidently wanted to do all the talking himself and continued to talk with the sort of eloquence and unrestrained irritability to which spoiled people are so prone. "Yes, I know you have made peace with the Turks without obtaining Moldavia and Wallachia. I would have given your sovereign those provinces as I gave him Finland. Yes, he went on, I promised and would have given the Emperor Alexander Moldavia and Wallachia, and now he won't have those splendid provinces. Yet he might have united them to his empire, and in a single reign would have extended Russia from the Gulf of Bothnia to the mouth of the Danube. Catherine the Great could not have done more, said Napoleon, growing more and more excited as he paced up and down the room, repeating to Balashev almost the very words he had used to Alexander himself at Tilsit. All that he would have owed to my friendship. Oh, what a splendid reign! He repeated several times, then paused, drew from his pocket a gold snuff-box, lifted it to his nose, and greedily sniffed at it. What a splendid reign the Emperor Alexander's might have been! He looked compassionately at Balashev, and as soon as the latter tried to make some rejoinder, hastily interrupted him. What could he wish or look for that he would not have obtained through my friendship? Demanded Napoleon, shrugging his shoulders in perplexity. But no, he has preferred to surround himself with my enemies. And with whom? With Steins, Armfeldts, Bennigsens, Wintzingerodes. Stein, a traitor expelled from his own country, Armfeldt, a rake and intriguer, Wintzingerode, a fugitive French subject, Bennigsen, rather more of a soldier than the others, but all the same an incompetent who was unable to do anything in 1807, and who should awaken terrible memories in the Emperor Alexander's mind. Granted that they were competent, they might be made use of, continued Napoleon, hardly able to keep pace in words with the rush of thoughts that incessantly sprang up, proving how right and strong he was in his perception the two were one and the same. But they are not even that. They are neither fit for war nor peace. Barclay is said to be the most capable of them all, but I cannot say so, judging by his first movements. And what are they doing, all these courtiers? Pfuel proposes, Armfeldt disputes, Bennigsen considers, and Barclay, called on to act, does not know what to decide on, and time passes, bringing no result. Bagration alone is a military man. He's stupid, but he has experience, a quick eye and resolution. And what role is your young monarch playing in the monstrous crowd? They compromise him and throw on him the responsibility for all that happens. A sovereign should not be with the army unless he is a general, said Napoleon, evidently uttering these words as a direct challenge to the emperor. He knew how Alexander desired to be a military commander. The campaign began only a week ago, and you haven't even been able to defend Vilna. You are cut in two and have been driven out of the Polish provinces. Your army is grumbling. On the contrary, your majesty, said Balashev, hardly able to remember what had been said to him, and following these verbal fireworks with difficulty, the troops are burning with eagerness. I know everything, Napoleon interrupted him. I know everything. I know the number of your battalions as exactly as I know my own. You have not 200,000 men, and I have 3 times that number. I give you my word of honor, said Napoleon, forgetting that his word of honor could carry no weight. I give you my word of honor that I have 530,000 men this side of the Vistula. The Turks will be of no use to you. They are worth nothing, and have shown it by making peace with you. As for the Swedes, it's their fate to be governed by mad kings. Their king was insane, and they changed him for another, Bernadotte, who promptly went mad, for no Swede would ally himself with Russia unless he were mad. Napoleon grinned maliciously and again raised his snuff-box to his nose. Balashev knew how to reply to each of Napoleon's remarks, and would have done so. He continually made the gesture of a man wishing to say something, but Napoleon always interrupted him. To the alleged insanity of the Swedes, Balashev wished to reply that when Russia is on her side, Sweden is practically an island. But Napoleon gave an angry exclamation to drown his voice. Napoleon was in that state of irritability in which a man has to talk, and talk, merely to convince himself that he's in the right. Balashev began to feel uncomfortable. As envoy, he feared to demean his dignity and felt the necessity of replying, but as a man, he shrank before the transport of groundless wrath that had evidently seized Napoleon. He knew that none of the words now uttered by Napoleon had any significance, and that Napoleon himself would be ashamed of them when he came to his senses. Balashev stood with downcast eyes, looking at the movements of Napoleon's stout legs, and trying to avoid meeting his eyes. "But what do I care about your allies?" said Napoleon. "I have allies, the Poles. There are 80,000 of them, and they fight like lions, and there will be 200,000 of them." And probably still more perturbed by the fact he had uttered this obvious falsehood, and that Balashov still stood silently before him in the same attitude of submission to fate, Napoleon abruptly turned around, drew close to Balashov's face, and gesticulating rapidly and energetically with his white hands, almost shouted, "Know that if you stir up Prussia against me, I'll wipe it off the map of Europe," he declared, his face pale and distorted by anger, and he struck one of his small hands energetically with the other. "Yes, I will throw you back beyond the Vilna and beyond the Dnieper, and I will re-erect against you that barrier which it was criminal and blind of Europe to allow to be destroyed. Yes, that is what will happen to you. That is what you will have gained by alienating me." And he walked silently several times up and down the room, his fat shoulders twitching. He put his snuff-box into his waistcoat pocket, took it out again, lifted it several times to his nose, and stopped in front of Balashov. He paused, looked ironically straight into Balashov's eyes, and said in a quiet voice, "And yet what a splendid reign your master might have had." Balashov, feeling it incumbent on him to reply, said that from the Russian side things did not appear in so gloomy a light. Napoleon was silent, still looking derisively at him and evidently not listening to him. Balashov said that in Russia the best results were expected from the war. Napoleon nodded condescendingly, as if to say, "I know it's your duty to say that, but you don't believe it yourself. I have convinced you." When Balashov had ended, Napoleon again took out his snuff-box, sniffed at it, and stamped his foot twice on the floor as a signal. The door opened. A gentleman in waiting, bending respectfully, handed the Emperor his hat and gloves. Another brought him a pocket handkerchief. Napoleon, without giving them a glance, turned to Balashov. "Assure the Emperor Alexander from me," said he, taking his hat, "that I am as devoted to him as before. I know him thoroughly and very highly esteem his lofty qualities. I will detain you no longer. General, you shall receive my letter to the Emperor." And Napoleon went quickly to the door. Everyone in the reception room rushed forward and descended the staircase. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7, read for LibriVox.org by Martin Seeloff. After all that Napoleon had said to him, those bursts of anger and the last dryly spoken words, "I will detain you no longer, General. You shall receive my letter," Balashev felt convinced that Napoleon would not wish to see him, and would even avoid another meeting with him, an insulted envoy, especially as he had witnessed his unseemly anger. But, to his surprise, Balashev received, through Duroc, an invitation to dine with the Emperor that day. Viziers Caulaincourt and Berthier were present at that dinner. Napoleon met Balashev cheerfully and amiably. He not only showed no sign of constraint or self-reproach on account of his outburst that morning, but, on the contrary, tried to reassure Balashev. It was evident that he had long been convinced that it was impossible for him to make a mistake, and that, in his perception, whatever he did was right, not because it harmonized with any idea of right and wrong, but because he did it. The Emperor was in very good spirits after his ride through Vilna, where crowds of people had rapturously greeted and followed him. From all the windows of the streets through which he rode, rugs, flags, and his monograms were displayed, and the Polish ladies welcoming him waved their handkerchiefs to him. At dinner, having placed Balashev beside him, Napoleon not only treated him amiably, but behaved as if Balashev were one of his own courtiers, one of those who sympathized with his plans and ought to rejoice at his success. In the course of conversation he mentioned Moscow and questioned Balashev about the Russian capital, not merely as an interested traveler asks about a new city he intends to visit, but as if convinced that Balashev, as a Russian, must be flattered by his curiosity. "How many inhabitants are there in Moscow? How many houses? Is it true that Moscow is called Holy Moscow? How many churches are there in Moscow?" he asked. And receiving the reply that there were more than 200 churches, he remarked, "Why such a quantity of churches?" "The Russians are very devout," replied Balashev. But a large number of monasteries and churches is always a sign of the backwardness of a people, said Napoleon, turning to Caulaincourt for appreciation of this remark. Balashev respectfully ventured to disagree with the French emperor. Every country has its own character, said he. But nowhere in Europe is there anything like that, said Napoleon. I beg your Majesty's pardon, returned Balashev. Besides Russia, there is Spain, where there are also many churches and monasteries. This reply of Balashev, which hinted at the recent defeats of the French in Spain, was much appreciated when he related it at Alexander's court, but it was not much appreciated at Napoleon's dinner, where it passed unnoticed. The uninterested and perplexed faces of the marshals showed that they were puzzled as to what Balashev's tone suggested. If there is a point we don't see it, or it is not at all witty, their expression seemed to say. So little was his rejoinder appreciated that Napoleon did not notice it at all, and naively asked Balashev through what towns the direct road from there to Moscow passed. Balashev, who was on the alert all through the dinner, replied that just as all roads lead to Rome, so all roads lead to Moscow. There were many roads, and among them the road through Poltava, which Charles XII chose. Balashev involuntarily flushed with pleasure at the aptitude of this reply. But hardly had he uttered the word Poltava before Caulaincourt began speaking of the badness of the road from Petersburg to Moscow and of his Petersburg reminiscences. After dinner they went to drink coffee in Napoleon's study, which 4 days previously had been that of the Emperor Alexander. Napoleon sat down, toying with his Sèvres coffee cup, and motioned Balashev to a chair beside him. Napoleon was in that well-known after-dinner mood which, more than any reasoned cause, makes a man contented with himself and disposed to consider everyone his friend. It seemed to him that he was surrounded by men who adored him, and he felt convinced that, after his dinner, Balashev too was his friend and worshipper. Napoleon turned to him with a pleasant, though slightly ironic, smile. "They tell me this is the room the Emperor Alexander occupied. Strange, isn't it, General?" he said, evidently not doubting that this remark would be agreeable to his hearer, since it went to prove his, Napoleon's, superiority to Alexander. Balashev made no reply, and bowed his head in silence. "Yes, 4 days ago, in this room, Witzengerode and Stein were deliberating," continued Napoleon, with the same derisive and self-confident smile. "What I can't understand," he went on, "is that the Emperor Alexander has surrounded himself with my personal enemies. That I do not understand. Has he not thought that I may the same?" And he turned inquiringly to Balashev, and evidently this thought turned him back on to the track of this morning's anger, which was still fresh in him. "And let him know that I will do so," said Napoleon, rising and pushing his cup away with his hand. "I'll drive all his Württemberg, Baden, and Weimar relations out of Germany. Yes, I'll drive them out. Let him prepare an asylum for them in Russia." Balashev bowed his head with an air indicating that he would like to make his bow and leave, and only listened because he could not help hearing what was said to him. Napoleon did not notice this expression. He treated Balashev not as an envoy from his enemy, but as a man now fully devoted to him, and who must rejoice at his former master's humiliation. "And why has the Emperor Alexander taken command of the armies? What's the good of that? War is my profession, but his business is to reign and not to command armies. Why has he taken on himself such a responsibility?" Again Napoleon brought out his snuff-box, paced several times up and down the room in silence, and then suddenly and unexpectedly went up to Balashev and with a slight smile, as confidently, quickly, and simply as if he were doing something not merely important but pleasing to Balashev, he raised his hand to the 40-year-old Russian general's face, and taking him by the ear, pulled it gently, smiling with his lips only. To have one's ear pulled by the emperor was considered the greatest honor and a mark of favor at the French court. "Well, adorer and courtier of the Emperor Alexander, why don't you say anything?" said he, as if it was ridiculous in his presence to be the adorer and courtier of anyone but himself, Napoleon. "Are the horses ready for the general?" he added, with a slight inclination of his head in reply to Balashev's bow. "Let him have mine. He has a long way to go." The letter taken by Balashev was the last Napoleon sent to Alexander. Every detail of the interview was communicated to the Russian monarch, and the war began. End of chapter 7. 9. Chapter 8. read for LibriVox.org. After his interview with Pierre in Moscow, Prince Andrew went to Petersburg on business, as he told his family, but really to meet Anatoly Kuryagin, whom he felt it necessary to encounter. On reaching Petersburg, he inquired for Kuryagin, but the latter had already left the city. Pierre had warned his brother-in-law that Prince Andrew was on his track. Anatoly Kuryagin promptly obtained an appointment from the Minister of War and went to join the army in Moldavia. While in Petersburg, Prince Andrew met Kutuzov, his former commander, who was always well disposed toward him, and Kutuzov suggested that he should accompany him to the army in Moldavia, to which the old general had been appointed commander-in-chief. So Prince Andrew, having received an appointment on the headquarters staff, left for Turkey. Prince Andrew did not think it proper to write and challenge Kuryagin. He thought that if he challenged him without some fresh cause, it might compromise the young Countess Rostova, and so he wanted to meet Kuryagin personally in order to find a fresh pretext for a duel. But he again failed to meet Kuryagin in Turkey, for soon after Prince Andrew arrived, the latter returned to Russia. In a new country, amid new conditions, Prince Andrew found life easier to bear. After his betrothed had broken faith with him, which he felt the more acutely the more he tried to conceal its effects, the surroundings in which he had been happy became trying to him, and the freedom and independence he had once prized so highly were still more so. Not only could he no longer think the thoughts that had first come to him as he lay gazing at the sky on the field of Austerlitz, and had later enlarged upon with Pierre, and which had filled his solitude at Bogucharovo, and then in Switzerland and Rome, but he even dreaded to recall them and the bright, boundless horizons they had revealed. He was now concerned only with the nearest practical matters unrelated to his past interests, and he seized on these the more eagerly the more those past interests closed to him. It was as if that lofty, infinite canopy of heaven that had once towered above him had suddenly turned into a low, solid vault that weighed him down, in which all was clear, but nothing eternal or mysterious. Of the activities that presented themselves to him, army service was the simplest and most familiar. As a general on duty on Kutuzov's staff, he applied himself to business with zeal and perseverance, and surprised Kutuzov by his willingness and accuracy in work. Not having found Kuryagin in Turkey, Prince Andrew did not think it necessary to rush back to Russia after him. But all the same, he knew that however long it might be before he met Kuryagin, despite his contempt for him, and despite all the proofs he deduced to convince himself that it was not worth stooping to a conflict with him, he knew that when he did meet him, he would not be able to resist calling him out, any more than a ravenous man can help snatching at food, and the consciousness that the insult was not yet avenged, that his rancor was still unspent, weighed on his heart, and poisoned the artificial tranquility which he managed to obtain in Turkey by means of restless, plodding, and rather vainglorious and ambitious activity. In the year 1812, when the news of the war with Napoleon reached Bucharest, where Kutuzov had been living for 2 months, passing his days and nights with a Wallachian woman, Prince Andrew asked Kutuzov to transfer him to the Western Army. Kutuzov, who was already weary of Bolkonsky's activity, which seemed to reproach his own idleness, very readily let him go, and gave him a mission to Barclay de Tolly. Before joining the Western Army, which was then, in May, encamped at Drissa, Prince Andrew visited Bald Hills, which was directly on his way, being only 2 miles off the Smolensk highroad. During the last 3 years there had been so many changes in his life, he had thought, felt, and seen so much, having traveled both in the East and the West, that on reaching Bald Hills it struck him as strange and unexpected to find the way of life there unchanged, and still the same in every detail. He entered through the gates with their stone pillars, and drove up the avenue leading to the house as if he were entering an enchanted sleeping castle. The same old stateliness, the same cleanliness, the same stillness reigned there, and inside there was the same furniture, the same walls, sounds, and smell, and the same timid faces, only somewhat older. Princess Mary was still the same timid, plain maiden, getting on in years, uselessly and joylessly passing the best years of her life in fear and constant suffering. Mademoiselle Bourienne was the same coquettish, self-satisfied girl, enjoying every moment of her existence and full of joyous hopes for the future. She had merely become more self-confident, Prince Andrew thought. De Salles, the tutor he had brought from Switzerland, was wearing a coat of Russian cut and talking broken Russian to the servants, but was still the same narrowly intelligent, conscientious, and pedantic preceptor. The old prince had changed in appearance only by the loss of a tooth, which left a noticeable gap on one side of his mouth. In character he was the same as ever, only showing still more irritability and skepticism as to what was happening in the world. Little Nicholas alone had changed. He had grown, become rosier, had curly dark hair, and when merry and laughing, quite unconsciously lifted the upper lip of his pretty little mouth, just as little princesses used to do. He alone did not obey the law of immutability in the enchanted sleeping castle. But though externally all remained as of old, the inner relations of all these people had changed since Prince Andrew had seen them last. The household was divided into two alien and hostile camps, who changed their habits for his sake and only met because he was there. To the one camp belonged the old prince, Mademoiselle Bourienne, and the architect; to the other Princess Mary, de Salles, little Nicholas, and all the old nurses and maids. During his stay at Bald Hills, all the family dined together, but they were ill at ease, and Prince Andrew felt that he was a visitor for whose sake an exception was being made, and that his presence made them all feel awkward. Involuntarily feeling this at dinner on the first day, he was taciturn, and the old prince, noticing this also, became morosely dumb, and retired to his apartments directly after dinner. In the evening, when Prince Andrew went to him, and, trying to rouse him, began to tell him of the Count Kamiensky's campaign, the old prince began unexpectedly to talk about Princess Mary, blaming her for her superstitions and her dislike of Mademoiselle Bourienne, who, he said, was the only person really attached to him. The old prince said that if he was ill it was only because of Princess Mary, that she purposely worried and irritated him, and that by indulgence and silly talk she was spoiling the little Prince Nicholas. The old prince knew very well that he tormented his daughter and that her life was very hard, but he also knew that he could not help tormenting her and that she deserved it. Why does Prince Andrew, who sees this, say nothing to me about his sister? Does he think me a scoundrel or an old fool who, without any reason, keeps his own daughter at a distance and attaches this Frenchwoman to himself? He doesn't understand, so I must explain it, and he must hear me out, thought the old prince. And he began explaining why he could not put up with his daughter's unreasonable character. "If you ask me," said Prince Andrew, without looking up, he was censuring his father for the first time in his life, "I did not wish to speak about it. But as you ask me, I will give you my frank opinion. If there is any misunderstanding and discord between you and Mary, I can't blame her for it at all. I know how she loves and respects you. Since you ask me," continued Prince Andrew, becoming irritable, as he was always liable to do of late, "I can only say that if there are any misunderstandings, they are caused by that worthless woman who is not fit to be my sister's companion." The old man first stared fixedly at his son, and an unnatural smile disclosed the fresh gap between his teeth to which Prince Andrew could not get accustomed. "What companion, my dear boy, eh? You've already been talking it over, eh?" "Father, I did not want to judge," said Prince Andrew in a hard and bitter tone. "But you challenged me, and I have said, and always shall say, that Mary is not to blame. But those to blame, the one to blame, is that Frenchwoman." "Ah, he has passed judgment." "Passed judgment," said the old man in a low voice, and, as it seemed to Prince Andrew, with some embarrassment. But then he suddenly jumped up and cried, "Be off! Be off! And let not a trace of you remain here." Prince Andrew wished to leave at once, but Princess Mary persuaded him to stay another day. That day he did not see his father, who did not leave his room and admitted no one but Mademoiselle Bourienne and Tikhon, but asked several times whether his son had gone. Next day, before leaving, Prince Andrew went to his son's rooms. The boy, curly-headed like his mother and glowing with health, sat on his knee, and Prince Andrew began telling him the story of Bluebeard, but fell into a reverie without finishing the story. He thought not of this pretty child, his son, whom he held on his knee, but of himself. He sought in himself either remorse for having angered his father, or regret at leaving home for the first time in his life on bad terms with him, and was horrified to find neither. What meant still more to him was that he sought and did not find in himself the former tenderness for his son, which he had hoped to reawaken by caressing the boy and taking him on his knee. "Well, go on," said his son. Prince Andrew, without replying, put him down from his knee and went out of the room. As soon as Prince Andrew had given up his daily occupations, and especially on returning to the old conditions of life amid which he had been happy, weariness of life overcame him with its former intensity, and he hastened to escape from these memories and to find some work as soon as possible. "So you've decided to go, Andrew?" asked his sister. "Thank God that I can," replied Prince Andrew. "I am very sorry you can't." "Why do you say that?" replied Princess Mary. "Why do you say that when you are going to this terrible war and he's so old? Mademoiselle Bourienne says he has been asking about you." As soon as she began to speak of that, her lips trembled and her tears began to fall. Prince Andrew turned away and began pacing the room. "Ah, my God, my God! When one thinks who and what trash can cause people misery," he said with a malignity that alarmed Princess Mary. She understood that when speaking of trash he referred not only to Mademoiselle Bourienne, the cause of her misery, but also to the man who had ruined his own happiness. "Andrew, one thing I beg, I entreat of you," she said, touching his elbow and looking at him with eyes that shone through her tears. "I understand you." She looked down. "Don't imagine that sorrow is the work of men. Men are his tools." She looked a little above Prince Andrew's head with the confident, accustomed look with which one looks at the place where a familiar portrait hangs. "Sorrow is sent by him, not by men. Men are his instruments. They are not to blame. If you think someone has wronged you, forget it and forgive. We have no right to punish, and then you will know the happiness of forgiving." "If I were a woman I would do so, Mary. That is a woman's virtue. But a man should not and cannot forgive and forget," he replied. And though till that moment he had not been thinking of Kurágin, all his unexpended anger suddenly swelled up in his heart. "If Mary is already persuading me forgive, it means that I ought to long ago have punished him," he thought. And giving her no further reply, he began thinking of the glad, vindictive moment when he would meet Kurágin, who he knew was now in the army. Princess Mary begged him to stay one day more, saying that she knew how unhappy her father would be if Andrew left without being reconciled to him. But Prince Andrew replied that he would probably soon be back again from the army and would certainly write to his father, but that the longer he stayed now the more embittered their differences would become. "Goodbye, Andrew. Remember that misfortunes come from God, and men are never to blame," were the last words he heard from his sister when he took leave of her. Then it must be so, thought Prince Andrew as he drove out of the avenue from the house at Bald Hills. She, poor innocent creature, is left to be victimized by an old man who has outlived his wits. The old man feels he is guilty, but cannot change himself. My boy is growing up and rejoices in life, in which, like everybody else, he will deceive or be deceived. And I am off to the army. Why? I myself don't know. I want to meet that man whom I despise, so as to give him a chance to kill and laugh at me. These conditions of life had been the same before, but then they were all connected, while now they had all tumbled to pieces. Only senseless things, lacking coherence, presented themselves one after another to Prince Andrew's mind. End of chapter 8.